Hello there, my sleepy souls. Tonight, we journey into the fractured memories of the girl who sees everything except her own past. To the missing years when Alice Cullen was learning to exist without knowing who she had been. Guided by visions of a future friend she had never met. This is Alice's lost decade reimagined as an adventure with Bella Swan. The human girl who appeared in visions long before she appeared in Forks, who became Alice's anchor across time and her companion through the darkness of forgotten memories. I don't love asking for this, but if you've been enjoying the videos, I'd truly appreciate it if you considered subscribing. I'm hoping to reach 1,000 subscribers before Christmas, and your support would mean a great deal. It also helps me keep creating these Twilight stories for you. Alright, now it's time. Let the visions carry you softly back to 1920, where a girl named Mary Alice Brandon wakes in darkness with no memory and no name. The asylum in Biloxi existed as the kind of institution that polite Mississippi society preferred not to acknowledge or discuss. Its brick walls containing the inconvenient members of respectable families whose behaviors or conditions, or simply whose existence created problems that could not be managed through conventional means within households that valued reputation above the welfare of daughters or wives or sisters whose madness or defiance or difference made them unsuitable for the drawing rooms and dinner tables, where appearances mattered more than truth. The building sat on grounds that had once been plantation land before the Civil War, had ended that particular horror, and replaced it with different horrors that were less visible but no less destructive to those trapped within systems designed to contain rather than to heal, to hide rather than to help the human beings whose minds or bodies or spirits operated outside the narrow parameters that early 20th century Southern culture considered acceptable or normal or sane enough to exist among the general population without supervision or confinement. Mary Alice Brandon had been committed to this place by her father, whose reasons were documented in admission papers that described prophetic visions and disturbing predictions about future events that the girl could not possibly know through conventional means. Her claims about seeing things before they happened making her either genuinely mad or genuinely supernatural in ways that threatened her father's standing in the community and threatened the family's carefully maintained respectability, that could not survive having a daughter who spoke about visions and futures and deaths that had not yet occurred, but that she described with certainty that proved accurate often enough to frighten those around her into believing she possessed abilities that respectable Christian families should not harbor within their homes. Her mother had died under circumstances that remained unclear in official records, but that whispered rumors suggested involved violence within the Brandon household. Her younger sister Cynthia's death, following shortly after, in ways that the grieving father explained as illness, but that neighbors questioned in conversations they conducted quietly away from authorities who might have investigated more thoroughly if anyone had been willing to speak openly about their suspicions regarding what had actually happened to the Brandon women who disappeared from society and from life within the space of months. Alice woke in darkness that felt absolute and complete, her consciousness emerging from nothing into awareness that brought no memories and no context and no understanding of where she was or who she was or why the darkness pressed against her eyes with weight that suggested she was underground or enclosed in space too small for the panic that immediately filled her chest and her throat with pressure that would have made breathing difficult if breathing had still been necessary for the body that she did not yet understand, had been transformed into something that no longer required air or food or sleep or any of the biological necessities that had characterized her human existence before the transformation that she could not remember had changed everything about her physical nature while leaving her mind blank and empty of the personal history that should have accompanied her into this new existence. The thirst came next, overwhelming and immediate and demanding in ways that transcended ordinary hunger or ordinary desire. The burning in her throat creating agony that consumed her awareness and made thinking about anything except the need to satisfy this terrible craving seem impossible. Despite her attempts to understand what was happening and where she was and why her body felt simultaneously powerful and alien in ways that suggested she was no longer entirely human, even though she did not yet possess the vocabulary or the framework to articulate what she had become, or what vampire transformation meant for consciousness trapped in immortal body without memories to anchor identity or purpose. But in the darkness and the thirst and the confusion that threatened to overwhelm her completely, there was a face, a girl's face, appearing in her mind with clarity that seemed impossible given the chaos of her awakening. A young woman with brown eyes and brown hair and an expression of concern and compassion that felt familiar despite Alice having no memory of ever meeting this person or ever seeing this face, except in the vision that was not quite vision and not quite memory, but something else entirely that Alice's gift was providing without explanation or context about what these images meant, or why this particular girl's face would appear during this particular moment of awakening. The face brought comfort that defied logic. The strange girl's presence in Alice's fractured awareness, creating anchor point that allowed her to focus beyond the thirst and beyond the panic and beyond the overwhelming sensory input that her vampire nature was providing about the space around her and the sounds beyond the walls and the smells that she was only beginning to recognize as human blood and human life existing somewhere nearby in quantities that made the burning in her throat intensify until she wanted to scream or to cry or to do anything that might release the pressure building in her transformed body. The Vision Girl, because that was how Alice would come to think of her during these early moments of consciousness, seemed to be watching her with expression that communicated both sympathy and encouragement, as if this stranger understood what Alice was experiencing and approved of her somehow, despite the confusion and the fear and the inhuman thirst that was threatening to drive all other considerations from Alice's mind, except the need to hunt and to feed and to satisfy the craving that vampire nature demanded she address before attempting to understand the larger questions about identity or purpose or the circumstances that had led to her transformation and her awakening alone in this darkness. The girl in the vision appeared to be sitting in the darkness with her, her presence impossible but undeniable, her face becoming clearer as Alice focused on the image and allowed it to anchor her consciousness against the chaos of sensation and confusion that characterized these first moments of vampire existence for newborn, who had no maker to guide her and no memories to provide context for what she was experiencing or what she needed to do to survive this awakening without losing herself completely to the monster that vampire nature was encouraging her to become. Alice understood without knowing how she understood that the vision girl was real in some sense, even if she was not physically present in this moment. That the images appearing in her mind represented actual person who existed somewhere in time or space beyond this immediate darkness, that her gift, and she understood somehow that this was gift rather than madness, despite having no framework for understanding what supernatural abilities meant or how they functioned, was showing her someone important, someone who mattered to her future in ways that transcended normal human connection or normal human friendship. The certainty felt absolute despite the lack of rational justification. The knowledge that this brown-eyed girl represented something essential to Alice's existence, creating purpose that extended beyond the immediate needs of her newborn vampire body, and gave her reason to resist the thirst and to resist the urge to tear through whatever barriers confined her in this darkness and to hunt through the building whose layout she was beginning to perceive through the sounds and the smells that her enhanced senses provided, even through the walls that separated her from the humans whose heartbeats created rhythm that her vampire instincts recognized as prey, waiting to be claimed and consumed. The vision shifted and changed as Alice focused on the girl's face, the images expanding to show contexts and situations that made no immediate sense, but that suggested futures or possibilities or moments that had not yet occurred, but that Alice's gift was presenting as certainties, or at least as probabilities that would come to pass if certain conditions were met and certain choices were made. She saw the vision girl standing in sunlight that made her seem ordinary and human and fragile in ways that created protective instinct in Alice, despite not knowing this person or understanding why her safety would matter to someone who could not remember her own name or her own history, or anything about the life she had lived before waking in this darkness. She saw the girl sitting in locations that Alice did not recognize, wearing clothes from eras that seemed to belong to future decades rather than to the 1920s that Alice's awakening was occurring within. The temporal displacement suggesting that Alice's gift operated across time, in ways that allowed her to perceive futures that extended years or perhaps decades beyond the present moment that she was experiencing in this confined darkness. The transformation had occurred 3 days earlier, according to time frame that Alice's vampire nature understood instinctively, even though her conscious mind retained no memory of the event or the circumstances that had led to her maker's decision to transform her, rather than to allow her to die under whatever threat had prompted the intervention. The vampire who had changed her had been staff member at the asylum, his identity and his motivations remaining unknown to Alice in her awakened state, but his actions having saved her from death that another vampire had been planning. A hunter named James, whose tracking abilities had brought him to the asylum in pursuit of the girl whose visions had marked her as interesting quarry, worth hunting, across states and across months of patient stalking that had culminated in his arrival at the institution where Mary Alice Brandon had been confined, and where she should have been easy prey for predator who specialized in finding and killing humans, whose gifts or whose circumstances made them challenging targets worth the effort of extended hunts. But the asylum vampire had intervened before James could claim his prize. The staff member's decision to transform Alice rather than to allow her death representing either compassion or strategy, or perhaps simply impulsive choice made in moments when preventing James from succeeding, seemed more important than the consequences of creating newborn vampire who would awaken alone and confused without maker to guide her through the transition from human to immortal existence. The transformation had occurred in darkness similar to what Alice was experiencing now, her human body dying over the course of 3 days, while vampire venom rewrote her biology, and while her brain processed the conversion that would leave her with supernatural abilities, but without memories that should have survived the change intact, according to how vampire transformation typically functioned for those who underwent the process. The memory loss was unusual and was possibly connected to whatever circumstances had led to her asylum commitment, her human mind's prophetic abilities perhaps interfering with normal memory formation during transformation, or perhaps the trauma of her human experiences creating psychological barriers that prevented her transformed consciousness from accessing the personal history that should have accompanied her into vampire existence. The Vision Girl had been present throughout the transformation, even though Alice would not understand this until later reflection allowed her to recognize that the face appearing in her pain-addled awareness during the 3 days of burning had been the same face that appeared now in her awakening visions, that this mysterious brown-eyed stranger had somehow been companion through the worst of the physical agony that characterized vampire transformation for all who underwent the process of dying and being reborn as immortal predators. The girl's presence had made the burning bearable in ways that Alice could not articulate or fully understand, her face appearing whenever the pain threatened to overwhelm Alice's ability to maintain consciousness or sanity during the endless hours when vampire venom was destroying her human body and rebuilding it into something stronger and faster and more durable than anything human biology could achieve through natural evolutionary processes. Alice's maker had disappeared before her awakening, his reasons for leaving unknown, but his absence creating situation where Alice would need to teach herself vampire nature without guidance or instruction about how to control the thirst or how to move through human society without revealing what she had become, or how to understand and develop the gift that was already manifesting in ways that would have been overwhelming, even with experienced vampire to explain what the visions meant and how to interpret the images that were flooding her consciousness with information about futures and possibilities that she had no framework for processing or understanding. The hunter James had also departed after discovering that his prey had been transformed and thus rendered uninteresting to predator, whose satisfaction came from killing humans rather than from confronting vampire opponents who could match his strength and speed, and who would not provide the same psychological gratification that came from successfully stalking and destroying fragile mortal targets, whose fear and whose helplessness made them appealing to hunter, whose gift required challenge, but whose ego required ultimate control over the hunt's outcome. Alice began to move in the darkness, her vampire body responding to intentions with speed and strength that would have been impossible for her human form. Her hands finding the walls of what she now recognized as small underground chamber, or possibly basement room, where her maker had left her to complete her transformation and to awaken without supervision. That might have made the transition easier, but that circumstances had apparently prevented. The stone felt cool against her palms, despite the burning in her throat that was intensifying as her awareness of the humans living and working in the building above her grew more acute with each passing moment, their heartbeats creating symphony of temptation that her vampire instincts recognized as solution to the thirst that was threatening to drive all other considerations from her consciousness, except the need to feed and to satisfy the craving that defined newborn vampire existence for all who underwent transformation without preparation or without sufficient self-control to resist the overwhelming biological imperative to hunt. But the Vision Girl's face appeared again in Alice's awareness, the expression on her features communicating something that Alice interpreted as disappointment or perhaps sadness at the thought of Alice giving in to the thirst and hunting the humans whose blood would satisfy her physical needs, but would compromise something essential about who she was or who she could become if she chose differently in this moment. The interpretation felt certain, despite lacking rational foundation, Alice's gift somehow conveying emotional context, along with the visual images of the brown-eyed girl whose opinion mattered to Alice in ways that transcended logic or understanding, whose imagined disapproval created sufficient motivation for Alice to resist the urge to tear through the ceiling and to hunt through the asylum corridors where patients and staff existed, unaware of the monster who had been created in the darkness beneath their feet and who could destroy them all with ease if she chose to embrace her vampire nature without restraint or moral consideration for the lives she would be ending to satisfy temporary physical need. Alice found the exit through combination of systematic exploration and through visions that began showing her immediate futures, where she moved through specific doorways and followed specific paths that led up and out of the basement spaces where she had been confined during her transformation. The visions guided her movement with increasing clarity as she learned to distinguish between images showing actual futures and images showing possibilities that would not come to pass because she would make different choices or because circumstances would change in ways that prevented specific outcomes from manifesting into reality. She moved through darkness toward the ground level of the asylum building, her enhanced senses mapping the space around her and warning her about the locations of humans whose proximity made the thirst more difficult to ignore, but whose presence she needed to avoid if she intended to escape without succumbing to the urge to feed on the readily available prey that the asylum population represented to newborn vampire whose control had not yet developed and whose instincts screamed at her to hunt and to kill and to satisfy the burning that consumed her awareness whenever she focused too long on the sounds of heartbeats or the smell of blood that permeated the building's atmosphere. The Vision Girl appeared in Alice's awareness again as she approached the final barrier between the basement and the outside world. The brown-eyed stranger's face showed an expression that Alice interpreted as encouragement or perhaps pride that Alice was choosing escape over massacre. that she was prioritizing restraint over satisfaction, despite the difficulty of resisting the thirst that characterized newborn vampire existence for all who underwent transformation without preparation or guidance. The girl seemed to be smiling at Alice through the vision, her approval creating warmth in Alice's chest that competed with the burning in her throat, and that provided additional motivation to continue resisting the temptation to hunt the humans whose blood would be so easy to claim and so satisfying to consume, but whose deaths would compromise something that Alice instinctively understood mattered more than temporary relief from physical discomfort that would return regardless of how many humans she killed in this moment of weakness and confusion. Alice emerged into the night air of Mississippi in early spring of 1920. Her first moments of freedom as vampire occurring under stars that appeared brighter and more numerous than anything she could remember seeing before. Despite having no actual memories of her human life to compare against this supernatural clarity of vision that made the darkness seem almost as bright as daylight would have been to her human eyes, the asylum building loomed behind her as she ran, her vampire speed carrying her away from temptation and away from the hunger that would have driven her to slaughter if she had remained near the concentrated human population that the institution represented. She followed the vision girl's face through the darkness, the mysterious stranger's presence in her awareness, providing direction and purpose that transformed her escape from simple flight into journey toward future that Alice could not yet fully see, but that she understood with absolute certainty would eventually lead her to the brown-eyed girl, whose opinion mattered more than the thirst, and whose face had become Alice's anchor through the trauma of awakening alone without memories and without maker to explain what she had become, or what her gift meant for the immortal existence that stretched endlessly before her into futures she was only beginning to perceive through the visions that would guide her path forward toward destinations and purposes that remained unclear, but that somehow all connected back to the vision girl who had been present through the worst of Alice's transformation, and who would remain present through all the years that followed as companion and guide and future sister, whose love Alice could see across time even before they met in flesh and blood reality. The years following her escape from the asylum unfolded in patterns of trial and error and gradual discovery as Alice learned to exist as vampire without instruction manual or experience guide to explain the rules and the limitations and the possibilities that characterized immortal existence for creatures who no longer aged or sickened or died from anything except the specific violence that could destroy their stone-hard bodies through dismemberment and fire. She moved through the American South during the 1920s and 1930s. Her appearance as a young woman traveling alone, creating occasional questions from curious strangers, but her supernatural abilities to perceive immediate dangers and to avoid problematic encounters, allowing her to navigate human society with increasing confidence, despite lacking memories of how she had functioned within that society during her human years, before the asylum and before the transformation that had erased her personal history, while leaving her with instincts and knowledge that suggested she had once been someone who understood social interactions and social expectations well enough to move through respectable southern communities without drawing excessive attention. The hunting proved more difficult than Alice had anticipated during those early months and years, her vampire instincts driving her toward human prey, whose blood would satisfy her thirst completely and immediately, while her visions showed her the brown-eyed girl's face expressing disappointment or sadness whenever Alice considered giving in to the urge to hunt humans and to feed in the manner that vampire nature seemed designed to require. The first time she attempted to feed on a human, a drifter whose disappearance would likely go unnoticed and uninvestigated by authorities who had more pressing concerns than tracking missing persons who existed on society's margins. The vision girl appeared in her awareness with expressions so devastated and so betrayed that Alice found herself releasing the man and fleeing into the woods before she could complete the kill that her body craved and that her instinct demanded she finish now that she had begun the hunt and had cornered the prey, who could not escape her supernatural speed or her supernatural strength. The vision had shown her something that made no immediate sense, but that created powerful motivation to resist the temptation of human blood, despite the difficulty of controlling newborn vampire instincts that were designed specifically to drive recently transformed vampires toward the easiest and most satisfying prey sources available within their hunting territories. She had seen the brown-eyed girl hunting through forests similar to the ones where Alice currently stood, had seen this mysterious future friend pursuing deer and other animals with golden eyes that suggested vampire nature, but with restraint and control that indicated she fed on animal blood rather than on human blood, despite being immortal predator whose natural diet should have consisted primarily or exclusively of human prey. The vision made no logical sense given everything Alice understood about vampire nature from her own instincts and her own experiences, attempting to satisfy the thirst through methods that did not involve killing humans. But the certainty with which the images presented themselves suggested that this was genuine future possibility rather than wishful thinking or delusion, born from Alice's desire to avoid becoming monster who murdered innocent humans to satisfy biological needs that seemed absolute and non-negotiable. Alice began experimenting with animal blood during the months following that aborted human hunt, her attempts initially clumsy and unsatisfying, as she learned to track deer and mountain lions and other large mammals whose blood provided some relief from the burning in her throat, but whose inferior quality compared to human blood made the vegetarian lifestyle feel like constant deprivation that required willpower and determination that Alice had to renew with each hunt and with each moment of temptation, when human sense reached her and reminded her that satisfaction was available if she would simply abandon her self-imposed restrictions and embrace the predator nature that vampire transformation had designed her to embody. The Vision Girl's face appeared during each of these moments of weakness. Her golden eyes and her gentle expression providing Alice with motivation to continue resisting, despite the difficulty and despite the constant awareness that she was choosing a harder path, when easier path remained perpetually available through the simple act of hunting humans, whose blood called to her whenever she moved through towns or passed near farms or encountered travelers on the roads that connected southern communities during the Depression era, when poverty and desperation made human life seem even more fragile and even more temporary than usual. The discovery of her human identity came through systematic research in library archives and newspaper morgues, where Alice searched for any information about girls named Mary Alice, who disappeared or died during the years immediately preceding 1920, when her vampire life had begun in the asylum basement, where she had awakened without memories or context. The search consumed months as she traveled between towns and cities across Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee. Her inquiries carefully worded to avoid drawing attention to herself or revealing the supernatural nature of her interest in records and obituaries and asylum admission documents that might contain clues about who she had been before the transformation had erased her personal history and left her with only the strange gift of seeing futures that had not yet occurred. The Vision Girl accompanied Alice through these searches in ways that made the tedious work bearable, despite the frustration of finding nothing useful or finding information that led nowhere, or that described girls named Mary Alice, who were clearly not the person Alice had been before her transformation. She saw the Vision Girl sitting beside her in future moments, when Bella, though Alice did not yet know the girl's name, would be conducting similar research about Alice's past, would be reading the same newspaper archives and the same admission records with expression of sorrow and anger at what had been done to the girl who had become her sister and her friend across decades of friendship that Alice could perceive through her visions, even though those decades had not yet elapsed and would not elapse until Alice had lived through all the years of waiting that separated her present moment from the future moment when the brown-eyed girl would finally become real and present rather than vision and promise. The breakthrough came in a Biloxi newspaper archive during the spring of 1928, when Alice found her own death notice published 8 years earlier. The brief announcement describing how Mary Alice Brandon, daughter of prominent merchant, had died while confined to asylum for treatment of nervous disorder, characterized by prophetic delusions and disturbing predictions about family tragedies that had unfortunately come to pass exactly as the disturbed young woman had foreseen, despite medical efforts to cure her of the psychological affliction that had made her unsuitable for normal social life. The notice mentioned her mother and sister, who had preceded her in death, their passing attributed to illness, though the date suggested they had died within months of each other during the same year that Mary Alice had been committed to the institution where she would eventually die, according to official records that Alice now knew were false, or at least incomplete, given that she had not died, but had been transformed into vampire, whose existence extended 8 years beyond the date when Mary Alice Brandon had supposedly expired from natural causes while receiving institutional care. Alice felt nothing upon reading her own obituary, the lack of emotional response suggesting that whatever memories or attachments she should have felt toward the name and the family and the life described in the newspaper notice had been erased so completely during her transformation that even discovering her human identity created no recognition or connection to the person she had been before waking in the asylum darkness. But in her vision, she saw the brown-eyed girl reading the same notice with tears streaming down her face, saw this future friend grieving for Mary Alice Brandon with intensity that suggested deep personal connection, despite the girl obviously being too young to have known Alice during her human life, and despite the temporal impossibility of their having met before Alice's transformation had occurred. The vision made Alice's own grief possible through borrowed emotion, the brown-eyed girl's sorrow becoming Alice's sorrow in ways that allowed her to mourn the lost human girl whose life had been stolen first by her father's betrayal, and then by whatever violence had claimed her mother and sister, and then by the transformation that had erased her memories and left her with only the name and the death notice, and the terrible knowledge that Mary Alice Brandon had suffered visions that had made her family fear her enough to confine her to asylum, where she had been convenient prey for supernatural hunter who had tracked her across state lines and had nearly killed her before another vampire's intervention had transformed tragedy into different kind of tragedy. The asylum admission papers that Alice located through careful investigation and through bribes paid to clerks who maintained institutional records revealed more details about her human life and about the circumstances leading to her commitment by father, who had described his daughter's visions as demonic possession or madness, requiring medical confinement and treatment that might cure her of the affliction, that made her predict deaths and disasters with accuracy that terrified those around her, and that suggested supernatural abilities incompatible with respectable Christian families' reputation within their community. The papers described Mary Alice Brandon as dangerous to herself and others, her prophecies about her mother's death and her sister's death having come true within weeks of her making the predictions, and thus creating suspicion that she had somehow caused the tragedies she had foreseen, or that she possessed knowledge of her father's plans that she should not have been able to access through normal means of observation or investigation. Alice understood through reading these clinical descriptions that her human self had seen her mother's murder and her sister's murder before they occurred, had tried to warn them or to prevent the violence that her father was planning, and had been silenced through commitment to asylum, where her warnings would be dismissed as delusions and where her death would seem natural rather than suspicious, when it eventually occurred under circumstances that would not be thoroughly investigated, because institutional deaths rarely receive the scrutiny that deaths in respectable homes might receive from authorities concerned about murder or foul play. The Vision Girl appeared in Alice's awareness as she processed this information, the brown-eyed stranger's expression showing rage on behalf of the human Mary Alice, who had been betrayed by the parent who should have protected her, and who had been punished for trying to save her family from violence that she could see coming, but could not prevent through any action that adults would take seriously or believe, coming from teenage girl whose visions marked her as mad rather than as gifted. The graves existed in small cemetery outside Biloxi, where the Brandon family plot contained 3 markers bearing the names of Alice's mother and sister, and supposedly Alice herself, though obviously the 3rd grave contained no actual body, given that Alice had not died when the records claimed, but had been transformed, and had escaped, and had been living as vampire for 8 years, by the time she located the burial site during a spring night in 1928, when the humidity made the air thick, and when the Spanish moss hanging from nearby trees created atmosphere of gothic sorrow that seemed appropriate for the scene of Alice, standing before graves of family she could not remember, but whose loss she felt through the vicarious grief that her visions of the brown-eyed girl provided. She saw her future friend standing in this exact location, decades in the future, saw her placing flowers on the graves and crying for the Brandon women, whose deaths had gone unpunished, and whose suffering had been erased from official history through records that obscured the truth about what had actually happened to them, and why Mary Alice had been the only one whose death had been false, even though her life had ended just as completely as her mother's, and sisters' lives had ended through the violence and the betrayal that had characterized the final months of Mary Alice Brandon's human existence. Alice chose her own name during the quiet moments after leaving the cemetery. Her decision to keep Alice while abandoning Mary and Brandon, representing her acceptance that she was no longer the human girl who had died officially and metaphorically 8 years earlier, but was instead someone new, who had been born from that death, and who would build identity based on choices, rather than based on history that she could not access, except through documents and visions that showed her past reflected in future friends' grief. The Vision Girl approved of this choice in ways that Alice perceived through her gifts increasing clarity about the brown-eyed stranger, who was slowly becoming more defined and more real with each passing year, as Alice moved closer to the moment when they would finally meet in flesh and blood reality, rather than in visions that showed futures and possibilities that had not yet manifested into actual experiences. The vegetarian lifestyle became easier with practice and with time, as Alice's control improved, and as her body adjusted to the inferior satisfaction that animal blood provided compared to human blood, that remained constant temptation whenever she moved through populated areas or encountered humans, whose sense reminded her that better option existed if she would simply abandon the restrictions she had imposed on herself through determination, to become the kind of vampire that the Vision Girl's golden eyes suggested was possible, despite conventional vampire wisdom indicating that resisting human blood was unnecessary suffering that served no purpose except to make immortal existence more difficult than it needed to be. But Alice maintained her chosen path through those years of wandering and learning. Her commitment strengthened each time she saw visions of herself and the brown-eyed girl hunting together through forests in future decades, when they would be family and friends and sisters bound by choices rather than by blood or by history that they shared. She was becoming Alice rather than remaining Mary Alice Brandon. The transformation from human to vampire, supplemented by the transformation from lost girl to self-determined woman, who would meet her future on her own terms, and who would arrive at the moment of meeting the Vision Girl as someone worthy of the friendship and the love that Alice could see waiting for her in the visions that guided her path forward through the years of solitude and searching that characterized this period of her immortal existence, when she was alone but never entirely alone, because the brown-eyed girl was always present in her awareness as companion and guide and promise, that the waiting would eventually end in belonging, that would justify every difficulty and every sacrifice that Alice had endured while teaching herself to exist as vampire without maker or family or anyone except the vision friend, whose face had become more precious to Alice than any memory she had lost, or any identity she had abandoned in the asylum darkness where her immortal life had begun. The vision of Jasper came suddenly and completely during an afternoon in 1938, when Alice was working as waitress in a small diner outside Philadelphia. Her ability to anticipate customers' orders before they spoke, making her popular with patrons who appreciated the efficiency and who tipped generously without understanding that supernatural abilities, rather than exceptional intuition, allowed her to have coffee poured and food ordered before they had consciously decided what they wanted from the limited menu that the establishment offered to travelers and locals who frequented the place during the Depression years when cheap meals and friendly service made modest diners like this one essential gathering places for communities struggling through economic hardship. She'd been pouring coffee for a regular customer when the vision hit with force that made her freeze in place. The pot still tilted over the cup, while her consciousness traveled forward through time to moment, a decade in the future, when she would meet the golden-eyed man, whose face she was seeing clearly for the first time, despite having perceived fragments and hints of his presence in earlier visions that had suggested someone important was approaching through the years, but had not revealed his identity or his significance with the clarity that this vision provided. He was beautiful in the way that all vampires were beautiful, his features perfect, and his bearing suggesting military background and decades or perhaps centuries of combat experience that had shaped how he moved and how he assessed his surroundings with constant vigilance that spoke to trauma and to survival instincts developed through experiences that Alice could sense had been terrible and formative in ways that had left him damaged but not broken, despite the weight of guilt and regret that she perceived radiating from him, even through the vision that showed his future, rather than his present state. His eyes were gold like Alice's own eyes, and like the eyes of the brown-eyed girl who appeared in Alice's visions wearing golden eyes. Whenever Alice saw her hunting or saw her moving through vampire existence, that the visions suggested would be the girl's future after transformation that Alice could perceive approaching, but could not yet see clearly enough to understand the timing or the circumstances that would lead to the human girl becoming immortal and joining the family that Alice was seeing more clearly with each passing year. But the most significant detail in the vision was not Jasper alone, but Jasper with the brown-eyed girl visible in the background of the future moment when Alice would be introducing them. The scene showing Alice's two most important relationships existing simultaneously and harmoniously in ways that suggested the three of them would be family together, rather than Alice having to choose between the mate she was seeing and the friend she had loved, through visions for nearly 2 decades of waiting and watching and learning to exist, as a vampire guided by the promise of belonging that the girl's face had represented since Alice's awakening in the asylum darkness. The vision girl, who Alice could now see more clearly as young woman, rather than as the teenager she'd appeared to be in earlier visions, was smiling at Jasper with expression of acceptance and affection that suggested she would welcome him as brother and friend, despite whatever horrors his past contained. Her capacity for forgiveness and her capacity for love, apparently extending to damaged vampire warrior whose guilt Alice could perceive, even through the temporal distance that separated her present moment from the future moment when this meeting would actually occur. Alice saw the diner where she would meet Jasper, the specific location in Pennsylvania, rendered in perfect detail that would allow her to position herself correctly when the time came to intercept him during his journey north from whatever territories he currently occupied in 1938 and whatever experiences he was currently enduring that would eventually motivate him to abandon his previous life and to search for alternative existence that would lead him to the diner and to Alice and to the family that she could see waiting for them in the futures beyond the initial meeting. She saw herself greeting him with words she would speak a decade hence, saw his surprised acceptance of her confident claim that he had kept her waiting, saw the immediate trust and immediate bond forming between them, despite his wariness and despite his accumulated suspicions about other vampires. After whatever betrayals and whatever violence had characterized his experiences before finding Alice, and finding the possibility of redemption through the vegetarian lifestyle that Alice's golden eyes advertised to anyone knowledgeable enough about vampire culture to recognize what the eye color signified. The vision expanded to show context and complications beyond the initial meeting. Alice, perceiving Jasper's history with the vampire Maria, who had created and used him during the Southern Vampire Wars, when newborn armies fought territorial battles that made exposure to human populations seem inevitable, and where Jasper's gift of emotional manipulation had made him valuable as soldier and commander, despite the psychological cost of feeling the terror and agony of every vampire he killed and every human he fed upon during the decades of violence that had defined his existence since his transformation during the 1860s, when he had been a young Confederate soldier whose military service had continued in twisted form through his vampire years serving Maria's ambitions. Alice felt his guilt through the vision with intensity that made her own chest ache with sympathetic pain. His self-loathing and his desperate desire for something better than endless violence, creating vulnerability that Alice understood she would need to address carefully when they finally met, because trust would not come easily to Vampire, who had been manipulated and betrayed by the Maker who had transformed him, and then had used him for decades before he found strength to leave. But Alice also saw beyond the guilt and beyond the trauma to the person Jasper would become after. Years or decades with the family that Alice was preparing to join saw him laughing with the brown-eyed girl, whose name Alice still did not know, but whose presence in the vision suggested she would be instrumental in Jasper's healing, just as Alice herself would be instrumental in providing him with the love and the partnership and the stability that would allow him to believe he deserved peace after the violence and the suffering that had characterized his immortal existence before meeting Alice would offer him alternative to the warrior existence that had been consuming him slowly across the decades since his transformation. The Vision Girl would become Jasper's friend and confidant, Alice perceived, their relationship developing into sibling affection that would complement rather than compete with the romantic bond between Alice and Jasper, and that would provide him with additional anchor to the family and to the lifestyle that Alice would be introducing him to when she guided him north toward the Cullens, whose existence Alice could now perceive more clearly through visions that showed the coven of golden-eyed vampires who practiced vegetarian lifestyle and who valued family bonds and who would accept Alice and Jasper despite their lack of conventional introduction or invitation. The waiting became more difficult after the vision clarified Jasper's timeline. Alice's awareness that a decade separated her from the meeting, making each day feel slower and making the work and the movement through human society feel like marking time rather than living actual life during the years between 1938 and 1948, when the vision showed their paths would finally intersect at the diner where Alice would be positioned, and waiting with perfect certainty about the day and the hour when Jasper would walk through the door, and when her decades of solitude would end through the meeting that would transform them both. She moved through those years with increasing impatience, despite understanding that the waiting served purposes she could not fully comprehend, that Jasper needed to reach a specific point in his own development before he would be ready to accept what Alice was offering, and before he would be capable of maintaining the vegetarian lifestyle that required control and commitment that he apparently had not yet developed during his years serving Maria and fighting in the Southern Wars. Alice saw the brown-eyed girl waiting during this same period, the vision showing her future friend living through her own human adolescence and early adulthood in locations that Alice could not quite identify, but that seemed to involve the American Southwest, based on the landscape and architecture visible in the backgrounds of visions that showed the girl reading and studying and moving through human life, unaware of the vampire family that was waiting for her, and unaware of Alice, who had loved her through visions for decades before they would meet. The parallel waiting created bond that Alice felt deeply, despite the impossibility of the girl knowing about Alice's existence or Alice's devotion during these years. When Alice was watching her grow and change and move through experiences that would shape the person she would become, when transformation eventually changed her from human to immortal and from stranger to sister, Alice began preparing during the years between the clear vision of Jasper and the actual meeting. Her preparation including learning everything she could about emotional control and about helping damaged vampires recover from trauma, and about the vegetarian lifestyle's challenges, so that she could guide Jasper effectively when he arrived struggling with guilt and with the transition from human blood to animal blood that Alice knew would be difficult for him after decades or perhaps a century of feeding on humans without restraint. She worked various jobs that allowed her to practice patience and to develop the social skills and the emotional intelligence that would serve her when Jasper needed support and needed understanding during the difficult early period of their relationship, when he would be learning to trust her and learning to believe that peace was possible after the violence that had defined his existence since his transformation. She also prepared wardrobe and prepared presentation, because the visions showed her that first impressions would matter, and that Jasper would respond to confidence and to certainty that Alice projected through her greeting and through her immediate claim on him as the person she had been waiting for across the years of solitude. Alice studied fashion magazines and learned to sew and to alter clothes until she could create looks that the visions showed would make her memorable and would make her appear as intentional and self-determined as she needed to appear when greeting vampire warrior who had spent decades following orders from Maker who had controlled and manipulated him. Alice needed to present herself as equal and as partner, rather than as another authority figure who would demand obedience, or another manipulator who would use him for her own purposes, the way Maria had used him during the Southern Wars. The countdown to 1948 felt eternal. Despite Alice's ability to see the meeting approaching through visions that showed the date and the location, and the exact moment when Jasper would walk through the diner door, and when Alice would speak the words that would begin their life together, and would end the decades of waiting that had characterized her existence since waking in the asylum darkness, guided by the vision girl whose face had promised that belonging was coming, and that family was waiting in futures that Alice was moving toward through each day of patience and preparation and hope that sustained her through the solitude and through the endless repetition of human interactions that felt hollow without the connections she could see waiting for her when the timing finally aligned. The diner in Philadelphia existed as unremarkable establishment serving mediocre food to travelers and locals who valued convenience over quality. Its location near major highways making it natural stopping point for those passing through the area during the late 1940s, when post-war America was rebuilding and when movement between cities and regions was increasing as soldiers returned home and as the economy began recovering from the Depression and the war years that had consumed the nation's resources and the nation's youth during the first half of the decade. Alice had positioned herself at this specific diner 6 months before the meeting was scheduled to occur. Her employment as waitress, allowing her to establish presence and to ensure she would be working on the correct day at the correct time, when Jasper would arrive exactly as her visions had shown across the decade of waiting and preparation that had brought her to this moment in March of 1948, when the future she had been anticipating would finally become present reality. She saw him through the window before he entered, his appearance matching the visions perfectly, despite the small details that living sight provided, beyond what Alice's gift had shown her during the years of watching his approach through time and through possibilities that had gradually solidified into certainties as the moment drew closer and as the futures became more fixed and more inevitable. He moved with the wariness of someone expecting attack or expecting betrayal, his posture suggesting readiness for violence despite the exhaustion visible in his features and despite the defeat that Alice could perceive in his bearing, even before her gift gave her access to the emotional turbulence radiating from him as he approached the diner entrance. His eyes were gold, like Alice's own eyes, the color indicating recent transition to animal blood that Alice knew had been motivated by his desperation to escape the guilt and the constant empathic feedback that feeding on humans had created for Vampire, whose gift made him feel his victim's terror and suffering with intensity that had become unbearable after decades of ignoring the psychological damage his feeding patterns created. Alice moved to intercept him the moment he crossed the threshold, her greeting delivered with the confidence and certainty that her visions had shown would be necessary to overcome his suspicion and his accumulated wariness about other vampires whose interactions with him had historically involved violence or manipulation or betrayal that had taught him to trust no one except possibly Maria, who had controlled him for so long that genuine autonomy felt foreign and uncomfortable even after he had finally found courage to leave her territory and her authority. She spoke the words she had rehearsed for a decade, her voice pitched to carry only to his supernatural hearing while appearing to human observers like normal waitress, greeting regular customer with familiar enthusiasm that drew no particular attention from the other patrons scattered throughout the diner's booths and counter seats. "You have kept me waiting," she said simply, the statement delivered as fact rather than as accusation, despite the decades of solitude she had endured while watching his approach through visions that had sustained her through the years of preparation and patience that had brought them both to this moment when the waiting would finally end and when belonging would begin for two vampires who had both been alone for too long despite existing within vampire society that should have provided community and connection, but that had instead provided only isolation and suffering for those whose natures or whose circumstances made them unsuitable for the violence and the casual cruelty that characterized much of vampire culture during the centuries before the Cullens, and a handful of other covens had demonstrated that alternative lifestyles were possible for those willing to endure the difficulties that vegetarian existence required. Jasper's response was immediate acceptance that surprised Alice, despite her visions having shown this exact reaction. His gift apparently perceiving the genuine affection and the genuine certainty radiating from her emotional state and his desperate need for connection, overcoming the suspicion that should have made him question how a strange vampire could know about his arrival or could speak with such confidence about their shared future when they had never met before this moment. He followed her outside without protest when she indicated they should leave the diner and should speak privately away from the human witnesses who could not understand vampire conversations about gifts and visions and the futures that Alice had been watching approach through the years of waiting that had prepared her for this meeting, but that had not quite prepared her for the overwhelming reality of finally touching Jasper's hand and feeling through his gift the emotions that visions had only approximated during the decade of anticipation. Alice told him about the brown-eyed girl during their first hours together. Her explanation of her visions, including prominent mention of the human who would become their sister, and who appeared in Alice's sight of their shared future with such consistency and such importance, that Jasper needed to understand from the beginning that their relationship existed within context of larger family that they were traveling toward, and that they would join together as partners rather than as isolated couple rejecting vampire society in favor of exclusive romantic bond. She described the girl whose name Alice still did not know despite having loved her through visions for nearly 3 decades. Her physical appearance rendered in detail that made Jasper comment that Alice seemed more connected to this hypothetical human than to the vampire mate she had finally met after years of supposed anticipation and supposed devotion that should have made Jasper the primary focus, rather than the mysterious future sister whose transformation Alice could perceive approaching, but whose timeline remained unclear beyond the certainty that she would eventually join them and would eventually become immortal through circumstances that Alice's visions had not yet clarified. But Alice's explanation satisfied Jasper once his gift perceived her genuine love for both him and for the Vision Girl, his empathic abilities apparently revealing that Alice's capacity for connection was large enough to encompass multiple relationships without diminishing the significance of any single bond, that her devotion to him did not compete with her devotion to the brown-eyed girl, but rather complemented it in ways that created foundation for the family they would build together once they located the Cullens, and once they eventually met the human whose face had guided Alice through the decades since her awakening in asylum darkness. Jasper understood through Alice's emotions what her words could not quite articulate, that the Vision Girl had been Alice's companion through years of solitude, and that expecting Alice to minimize that connection or to prioritize Jasper's feelings over her gratitude and affection for the friend who had sustained her through the worst periods of her existence would be unreasonable and would suggest insecurity that Alice's absolute certainty about their shared future should have prevented him from experiencing. The journey north toward the Cullens consumed months as Alice guided them through territories and through timing that her vision suggested would position them correctly for the meeting that she could see approaching with increasing clarity as they traveled through the American South and Mid-Atlantic regions during the summer and fall of 1948. Jasper struggled with the vegetarian lifestyle, despite his golden eyes indicating recent commitment to animal blood. His decades of feeding on humans making the transition more difficult than it had been for Alice, who had taught herself animal hunting during her early vampire years when her instincts were still developing and when her habits had not yet solidified around human prey that provided superior satisfaction and superior nutrition compared to animal alternatives that required more frequent feeding and more effort to achieve the same level of satiation that human blood provided with minimal hunting expenditure. Alice helped him through the difficult periods when the scent of human blood made resistance feel impossible and made the vegetarian commitment feel like unnecessary suffering that served no purpose except to make their existence more difficult than vampire nature seemed designed to tolerate. Her visions showing him the brown-eyed girl's future approval and the brown-eyed girl's future friendship, creating additional motivation beyond Alice's presence and Alice's support during the moments when Jasper's control wavered and when his guilt over his past made him believe he did not deserve the redemption that vegetarian lifestyle represented, or the peace that Alice promised was waiting for them with the Cullens, who practiced this difficult way of existing without judgment and without the constant violence that had characterized Jasper's experience of vampire culture during his decades serving Maria. Alice showed him through her descriptions of the visions that the brown-eyed girl would love him despite his past, would accept him as brother, despite the decades of killing, and despite the trauma that had shaped him into the damaged vampire warrior who was learning slowly to believe that monsters could choose to become something other than monsters through sustained effort and through support from those who refused to define him solely by his worst actions or his worst periods. Jasper's gift of emotional manipulation became asset during their journey, despite his initial reluctance to use abilities that reminded him of Maria and reminded him of the ways he had been forced to control newborn armies and to manufacture loyalty through emotional coercion that had made him complicit in the manipulation and the violence that had defined the Southern Vampire Wars, where he had functioned as weapon and as commander. But Alice encouraged him to practice his gift in constructive ways that served rather than exploited those around them. His ability to calm aggressive humans or to ease suffering in situations where they encountered pain or fear, making his gift valuable for purposes beyond the violence and the control that had characterized his previous applications during the decades serving Maria's territorial ambitions. Alice showed him through her visions that the brown-eyed girl would eventually ask for his help managing her own difficult emotions, that his gift would become source of comfort and healing rather than source of trauma once he learned to use it with consent and with compassion, rather than with the cold strategic calculation that military applications had required during his years fighting vampire wars. The Cullens appeared in Alice's visions with increasing detail as she and Jasper traveled north. The family of golden-eyed vampires led by compassionate doctor who had discovered the vegetarian lifestyle centuries earlier and who had built his coven based on principles of redemption and chosen family rather than based on traditional vampire values of strength and dominance and casual disregard for human life beyond its utility as food source. Alice saw Carlyle's immediate acceptance of them despite their lack of formal introduction. saw Edward's initial suspicion giving way to friendship once he heard Alice's thoughts about the Vision Girl, and once he understood that Alice's gift provided genuine precognition rather than wishful thinking or delusion that might threaten the family's security through false confidence about futures that would not actually materialize. She saw Rosalie's resistance and Emmett's enthusiasm, and Esme's maternal warmth that would make both Alice and Jasper feel welcomed, despite their sudden arrival, and despite the strangeness of Alice's explanation about visions that had guided them to this specific family at this specific time in pursuit of belonging, that Alice had perceived across decades of watching their future approach through the years of solitude and preparation. But most importantly, Alice saw the brown-eyed girl in the Cullens' future, her presence among them not as visitor or as temporary guest, but as permanent family member whose transformation would bind her to them as surely as Alice's arrival with Jasper was about to bind them to the Cullens through the choices and the visions that had brought them all together. Alice described these visions to Jasper during their final weeks of travel before reaching the Cullens, her certainty about the human girl's importance making Jasper understand that their joining this family was not random choice or convenient arrangement, but was essential step toward the future that Alice had been navigating toward since her awakening in the asylum, when the Vision Girl's face had first appeared to guide her through the darkness and the confusion and the thirst that had threatened to consume her before she learned to resist and to choose differently than vampire instinct demanded. They arrived at the Cullens' residence during late autumn of 1948, Alice's visions having guided them to the correct location, despite having never received directions or invitation from the family, who had no awareness that 2 additional vampires were approaching with intention of joining their coven permanently, rather than visiting briefly as curious observers of the vegetarian lifestyle that most vampires dismissed as impossible or as unnecessary suffering. Alice greeted Carlyle with the same confidence she had greeted Jasper, her explanation of her visions and her certainty about their future with this family delivered in tone that suggested she was announcing fact rather than requesting permission or seeking approval for decision that had already been made through processes that transcended normal social conventions about how covens formed and how vampires joined existing families. She told them about the brown-eyed girl within the first hours of their arrival, her description of the human who would eventually join them, creating curiosity and skepticism in equal measure among family members who had never encountered vampire whose visions extended decades into future, with specificity that Alice demonstrated through accurate predictions about immediate events and through knowledge of family history that she should not have possessed without having touched Aro's hand or having spent years researching the Cullens through conventional means. Edward heard the name Bella Swan in Alice's thoughts before Alice knew the girl's name herself, the telepathic vampire perceiving futures and visions that Alice's gift was showing her with increasing clarity as they settled into their new life with the Cullens. And as the timeline approached the moment when Bella would enter their existence and would transform their family through her presence and through the love that Alice had perceived waiting for them in the decades of futures that remained between 1948 and the moment when vision would finally become reality, and when the girl who had been Alice's companion for nearly 30 years would finally become real rather than promise. The decades with the Cullens before Bella's arrival unfolded in patterns of repetition and anticipation that characterized vampire existence for those who chose to live among humans through the elaborate pretense of mortality that required moving every few years before their lack of aging became noticeable, and before their presence in communities created questions that could not be answered without revealing the supernatural truth about their nature and their immortality. Alice adapted to the family routines with ease that surprised even Carlyle, who had centuries of experience welcoming damaged vampires into his coven, and who had learned to recognize when new members would integrate successfully versus when their personalities or their histories would create conflicts that might fracture the carefully maintained harmony that made their vegetarian lifestyle sustainable across decades of living in close proximity, while managing the constant temptation of human blood that surrounded them in the high schools and the hospitals and the communities where they positioned themselves to maintain their cover as normal American family, moving frequently for plausible career-related reasons that humans accepted without excessive investigation. Edward's initial suspicion of Alice transformed into fascination and eventually into sibling affection, as he spent years listening to her thoughts about the vision girl whose face dominated Alice's mental landscape with consistency that made Edward feel as though he knew Bella Swan years before she was born, and decades before she would move to Forks to live with her father and to attend the high school where the Cullens would be positioned when the timeline finally aligned, and when Alice's decades of waiting would end through the meeting that Edward could perceive approaching through Alice's thoughts with the same certainty that Alice herself felt whenever she focused on the futures that showed Bella entering their existence and transforming their family through her presence and through the relationships she would form with each of them, but especially through the relationship she would form with Edward himself, whose significance Alice could perceive, but whose details remained unclear in ways that made Edward both curious and anxious about the human girl, who apparently would become central to his existence, despite his centuries of solitary resistance to romantic attachments. Alice told the family repeatedly during those early years about Bella's importance and Bella's future role among them. Her descriptions of the brown-eyed girl who would become their sister delivered with such certainty and such affection that even Rosalie's resistance to the idea of human family member could not entirely dismiss Alice's visions as delusion or wishful thinking, despite Rosalie's philosophical objections to bringing humans into vampire existence, and despite her belief that immortality was curse rather than gift, and that recruiting humans into their lifestyle constituted cruelty rather than generosity, regardless of how the transformation might appear to the human, who had not yet experienced the losses and the limitations that vampire existence imposed on those who underwent the change from mortal to immortal. Alice understood Rosalie's resistance through visions that showed the complexity of Rosalie's feelings about her own transformation and about the humanity she had lost when Carlyle had saved her from death, but had condemned her to eternal existence as creature who could never have the children or the normal life that she had wanted during her human years before violence had destroyed her mortal future and had replaced it with immortal present that Rosalie experienced as prison, despite the beauty and the strength and the apparent advantages that vampire nature provided. But Alice persisted in her descriptions of Bella, and in her certainty that Bella's presence would benefit all of them, including Rosalie, whose resistance would eventually transform into protective affection. Once Bella proved herself worthy of the family's acceptance through qualities that Alice could perceive in her visions, but could not quite articulate in ways that would convince Rosalie to abandon her skepticism about human girl, who had not yet been born. When Alice first began speaking about her during the early 1950s, when the family was living somewhere in the northern United States, and when Alice's visions of Bella were still fragmented and uncertain about timing, even though the eventual outcome remained absolutely clear in Alice's gift that showed Bella as permanent fixture in their future, regardless of the obstacles or the complications that might arise during the decades between Alice's arrival with the Cullens and Bella's arrival in Forks. Jasper's integration into the family proved more difficult than Alice's integration, despite his genuine commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle, and despite his appreciation for the acceptance and the lack of judgment that Carlyle extended to Vampire, whose history included decades of violence and killing that would have made most covens reject him as too dangerous or too damaged to function within family structure that required trust and cooperation. His control around human blood remained precarious for years after joining the Cullens. The scent of humans triggering responses that decades of feeding on human prey had conditioned into his instincts and his reflexes in ways that animal blood consumption could not entirely override, despite his determination to maintain the vegetarian commitment that had motivated his departure from Maria's territory and his journey north to find Alice and to find the redemption that she had promised was possible for monsters willing to choose differently than their nature seemed to demand. Alice helped him through the difficult periods with patience that drew on her own early struggles, learning to resist human blood during her first years as vampire, when the thirst had been overwhelming, and when only the Vision Girl's disapproval had provided sufficient motivation to choose animal prey over the readily available humans, whose blood called to her whenever she moved through populated areas. She showed Jasper visions of Bella's future friendship with him, the brown-eyed girl's acceptance and affection visible in futures that Alice perceived with increasing clarity as the timeline approached the moment when Bella would enter their lives and would demonstrate the compassion and the understanding that would make Jasper believe he deserved the forgiveness he sought for the decades of violence that haunted him, despite Alice's assurances that his past did not define his future, and that redemption was available to those willing to pursue it, with genuine commitment rather than with the performative guilt that served no purpose except to maintain suffering that had already occurred and could not be changed through any amount of self-recrimination. The high school routines became Alice's least favorite aspect of vampire existence, despite her general enthusiasm for human customs and human social structures that fascinated her in ways that centuries-old vampires like Carlyle or Edward found tedious after endless repetitions of the same educational content and the same adolescent dramas playing out across decades of pretending to be teenagers attending American high schools in various regions and various decades. Alice endured the repetition because the visions showed that high school attendance would position them correctly for meeting Bella when she arrived in Forks, that the elaborate pretense of mortality and the careful maintenance of their cover as adopted siblings attending school together would create the circumstances that would allow Edward to meet Bella in biology class and would allow Alice to befriend her in the cafeteria and would allow the relationships to develop that Alice had been anticipating since her awakening in the asylum darkness nearly 4 decades earlier, when Bella's face had first appeared to guide Alice through the confusion and the isolation. Alice prepared continuously during those decades for Bella's arrival. Her preparation including accumulating clothes in styles and sizes that her visions showed Bella would appreciate and would wear after transformation, or perhaps even before transformation, if Alice could convince her to accept gifts from vampire who claimed to be her friend, based on visions rather than based on actual shared experiences or actual history together. She decorated spaces in whatever houses the family occupied with Bella in mind. Her choices about colors and furniture and arrangements influenced by visions that showed Bella's preferences and Bella's aesthetic sensibilities in ways that made Edward comment that Alice was preparing for Bella with more enthusiasm than she had prepared for Jasper, whose arrival had been equally anticipated, but apparently less important than the human girl's eventual appearance in their lives. But Alice's preparations served purposes beyond simple enthusiasm or simple anticipation. Her understanding of her visions, making her recognize that Bella would need support and would need friendship and would need someone who had loved her before meeting her in ways that would make Bella's transition into vampire world easier and less traumatic than it might otherwise be if she entered their existence without Alice's established affection and established commitment to her well-being and her happiness. Alice was preparing to be the friend and the sister that Bella would need when she discovered that monsters were real and that the boy she loved was vampire and that her future would involve transformation and immortality and permanent separation from the human life and the human family that she would be leaving behind when she made the choice that Alice could see approaching through the visions that showed Bella's transformation as inevitable despite the complications and the obstacles that would arise during the period between their meeting and Bella's eventual change from human to immortal. The family moved to Forks during the early 2000s after Alice's visions clarified that this small, rainy town in Washington state would be the location where Bella would finally enter their lives. The decision to relocate motivated primarily by Alice's certainty about the timing and the location, despite the town's limited appeal and despite the constant cloud cover that would allow them to attend school during daytime hours without the sparkling skin exposure that direct sunlight created, making their attendance at sunny locations more complicated and more restrictive in terms of when they could move freely through human spaces. Carlisle accepted a position at the local hospital, while the younger family members enrolled in Forks High School, where they would maintain their cover as adopted siblings whose unusual beauty and whose unusual isolation from other students created curiosity and generated rumors, but did not create sufficient suspicion to threaten their security or to require premature departure before. Bella's arrival would justify their presence in this specific location during this specific period. Alice's anticipation intensified during the months immediately before Bella's scheduled arrival in Forks. Her visions showing the approach with increasing temporal precision that allowed her to count down the weeks and then the days and then finally the hours until Bella Swan would drive into town in an ancient truck. and would begin attending Forks High School, where Edward would notice her scent during biology class, and where Alice would finally meet the girl whose face had sustained her through nearly 40 years of waiting and watching and preparing for the moment when vision would become reality, and when the companion who had existed only in Alice's gift would finally become flesh and blood person, whose actual presence would either confirm or contradict the idealized version that Alice had constructed through decades of one-sided devotion. But Alice's visions showed that reality would exceed expectation, that Bella in person would be everything Alice had perceived through her gift and more, that the friendship they would build would justify the decades of anticipation and would create bond that would eventually transcend even death, when Bella's transformation would make them sisters in immortality as well as sisters in affection. Alice saw their future shopping trips and their future conversations and their future moments of crisis, where Alice's visions would save Bella's life, and where Bella's humanity would save Alice's soul in ways that animal blood and vegetarian lifestyle could approximate but could not fully achieve, without the genuine connection to human, whose existence reminded Alice why maintaining control and choosing compassion over convenience mattered beyond simple adherence to Carlyle's philosophical principles about vampire responsibility toward the prey species that sustained vampire existence. The false alarms during the years of waiting had been difficult. Moments when Alice had encountered human girls whose appearance or whose mannerisms had reminded her of Bella, but whose faces had not matched the vision, and whose presence in Alice's awareness had felt wrong in ways that her gift confirmed by showing futures where these girls disappeared from Alice's life without significance and without the transformative impact that Bella's arrival would create. Alice had learned through these disappointments to trust her visions absolutely, and to recognize the difference between superficial similarity and genuine recognition. Her gift's precision about Bella's identity, meaning that Alice would know with certainty when the right girl finally arrived, rather than experiencing doubt or confusion about whether this particular brown-eyed human might be the person Alice had been waiting for across the decades since her asylum awakening. Edward's growing frustration with hearing Bella's name in Alice's thoughts for decades before Bella existed in his actual experience created tension that Alice mostly ignored, because she understood through her visions that Edward's irritation would transform into obsession and devotion. Once he finally met Bella, and once he heard her silent thoughts, or rather, once he failed to hear her thoughts, because Alice's vision suggested that Bella would be exception to Edward's telepathy in ways that would fascinate him and would create the mystery and the challenge that a century of easily accessible human minds had denied him. Alice saw Edward's future love for Bella with clarity that made his current skepticism seem amusing rather than concerning. Her certainty about their eventual relationship making her patient with his complaints about the hypothetical human who dominated Alice's mental landscape despite never having met any of them, and despite existing only as future possibility rather than as present reality that Edward could engage with directly. Esme's maternal interest in Alice's descriptions of Bella created alliance that Alice valued because Esme's support would prove essential when Bella eventually needed protection or needed advocacy within family debates about her transformation and her future with them. Esme understood through Alice's visions that Bella would complete their family in ways that even Alice's arrival with Jasper had not quite achieved, that the human girl would provide the heart and the humanity that would remind them all why their vegetarian lifestyle and their integration into human communities mattered beyond simple survival strategy or simple philosophical commitment to Carlyle's principles about minimizing harm and maximizing coexistence with the species that should have been their prey, but that they had chosen to protect through their restraint and through their careful concealment of their true nature. The moment finally arrived during January of 2005, when Alice's visions showed Bella's truck crossing into Forks, and showed Bella moving into her father's house, and showed the timeline aligning perfectly for the meeting that Alice had anticipated since 1920, when the Vision Girl's face had first appeared in asylum darkness to guide Alice through awakening and through the decades of solitude that had brought her finally to this point, where waiting would end and where belonging would begin, through friendship that had been forming across time, long before either of them had been aware that the other existed. The vision of Bella's truck entering Fork City limits appeared in Alice's awareness 3 days before the actual event occurred, the temporal precision of her gift having improved dramatically during the decades of focusing on this specific future and this specific person, whose arrival would mark the end of Alice's long wait and the beginning of the adventure that she had been preparing for since her awakening in the asylum darkness, when Bella's face had first appeared to guide her through these confusion and the terror of newborn vampire existence without memories or maker or any context for understanding what she had become. Alice watched the vision replay dozens of times during those final 3 days, her excitement and her anxiety creating unusual restlessness that the family noticed, but that Alice could not entirely explain even to Jasper, whose empathic gift made him acutely aware of her emotional state, and whose concern about her stability during this period prompted gentle questions about whether Alice was certain that meeting this human girl would fulfill the expectations that 40 years of anticipation had created through visions that might have idealized reality beyond what actual Bella Swan could possibly achieve. But Alice's certainty remained absolute despite Jasper's concerns and despite her own awareness that decades of one-sided devotion had created relationship where she loved Bella completely. While Bella had no knowledge of Alice's existence or Alice's feelings, or the role that Bella's face had played in sustaining Alice through the hardest periods of her vampire existence, when loneliness and purposelessness had threatened to overwhelm her commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle and to the future that the vision's promise was approaching. If Alice maintained her patience and her faith, that the waiting would eventually end in belonging, that would justify every sacrifice and every difficult choice she had made while teaching herself to exist as vampire without the guidance or the support that makers typically provided to their newborns during the crucial early years of adjustment and learning. Edward saw Bella first during biology class on her initial day at Forks High School. His reaction to her scent and his reaction to her silent mind creating crisis that Alice had anticipated through visions but had not quite prepared for emotionally, because watching Edward struggle with the urge to kill Bella versus the urge to flee from Bella made Alice's protective instincts surge with intensity that surprised her despite having loved Bella through visions for 4 decades. Alice's gift showed her the possible futures branching from this moment. The timelines where Edward lost control and killed Bella in the classroom, creating horror that Alice refused to allow to manifest into reality, despite understanding that her interference might alter futures in ways that would prevent other important outcomes from occurring, according to the patterns her visions had shown during the years of watching their collective destiny approach. She intercepted Edward after school before he could flee to Alaska, or before he could return to the biology classroom, to test his control against Bella's scent in ways that might result in the massacre that Alice's visions showed as genuine possibility, rather than as paranoid fantasy that Edward's century of restraint should have made impossible. Alice told him what she had seen, her description of the futures where he and Bella fell in love, and where their relationship became central to the family's existence, and where Bella's transformation eventually made her Edward's mate for eternity, providing sufficient motivation for Edward to resist both the urge to kill and the urge to flee, despite the unprecedented strength of Bella's appeal to his vampire instincts, and despite the equally unprecedented silence of her mind that created mystery and fascination that a century of easily accessible human thoughts had never provided. Alice's first actual meeting with Bella occurred in the cafeteria several days after Bella's arrival, when the visions showed that Bella's curiosity about the Cullen family had reached the point where introduction would seem natural rather than forced or suspicious in ways that might make Bella uncomfortable, or might make her question why a beautiful strange girl was approaching her with enthusiasm that normal acquaintances would not demonstrate towards someone they had never spoken to before. Alice positioned herself carefully, her approach choreographed through visions that had shown her exactly how to make Bella feel welcomed, rather than threatened by a vampire whose enthusiasm and whose confidence might otherwise seem overwhelming, or might seem like mockery given the significant differences in their appearances and their social positions within the high school hierarchy that placed the Cullens at the top through their beauty and their wealth and their mysterious isolation, while placing Bella somewhere in the middle through her ordinariness and her newcomer status. The moment of actual physical proximity to Bella, after 40 years of loving her through visions, created emotional response in Alice that she had not anticipated despite her gift's precision about most aspects of this meeting and this relationship. The reality of Bella's warmth and Bella's scent and Bella's actual presence in three-dimensional space rather than in vision space, making Alice want to cry with relief and joy, and the overwhelming realization that the girl who had sustained her through decades of waiting was real and was here and was everything Alice had perceived through her gift, and more because visions could not capture the subtle details of personality and presence that made Bella uniquely herself, rather than simply the idealized vision friend who had existed in Alice's awareness since 1920. Alice spoke carefully during their first conversation, her enthusiasm tempered by awareness that Bella had no context for understanding why Alice seemed so eager to befriend her, and why Alice spoke with certainty about their future friendship, as though it were established fact rather than hopeful possibility that required Bella's consent and Bella's reciprocal interest in forming relationship with strange vampire girl, whose family's beauty and whose family's isolation had already marked them as different and potentially dangerous within the small community where everyone knew everyone, and where the Cullens' wealth and their detachment from normal social interactions created speculation and rumor that Bella had undoubtedly already heard during her first days attending Forks High School. But Bella responded to Alice's overtures with cautious warmth that the visions had shown would characterize her initial reactions to Alice's friendship, her natural reserve, and her natural skepticism about her own worthiness of attention from someone as apparently perfect as Alice, creating barriers that Alice would need to overcome through patience and through demonstration that her interest was genuine, rather than pity or mockery or some elaborate social game that popular students sometimes played with less popular students for entertainment or for social status enhancement. Alice understood through her visions that Bella's self-esteem issues and Bella's difficulty accepting affection or accepting that people might genuinely want her friendship would require careful navigation during these early stages of their relationship, that pushing too hard or revealing too much too quickly might drive Bella away, rather than drawing her closer to the family and to the futures that Alice had been watching approach for decades. Edward's growing obsession with Bella during the weeks following her arrival created complications that Alice had anticipated, but had not fully appreciated until watching them unfold in present reality, rather than in future visions that had suggested the intensity, but had not quite conveyed the consuming nature of Edward's interest in the girl whose mind remained silent to his telepathy, and whose blood sang to his predatory instincts in ways that made every moment of proximity a test of control that century of vegetarian practice had prepared him for, but had not made easy or comfortable. Alice watched Edward struggle with decisions about whether to pursue relationship with Bella versus whether to maintain distance for her safety. Her visions showing that his eventual choice to pursue connection would lead to the love story that would transform both of them and would create the bond that would make Bella's transformation inevitable despite the dangers and despite the complications that human-vampire relationships created for families trying to maintain secrecy and trying to avoid the Volturi's attention. The Port Angeles incident, where Bella nearly became victim of human violence, created opportunity for Alice to demonstrate her gift's utility and her commitment to Bella's safety in ways that normal friendship would not have enabled. Her vision of the approaching danger allowing Edward to arrive in time to prevent the assault, but also allowing Alice to position herself as ally and protector, whose supernatural abilities could keep Bella safe from threats that Bella's human awareness could not perceive until too late. Alice's relief when the vision showed Bella surviving the encounter unharmed made her realize how completely her own well-being had become tied to Bella's survival and Bella's happiness during the short time since they had actually met. The decades of loving vision, Bella having created foundation for the intense protective devotion that Alice now felt toward actual Bella, whose vulnerability and whose mortality made every moment precious and every danger potentially catastrophic in ways that immortal existence rarely encountered, except when facing threats to mates or to family members whose permanent deaths would create losses that eternity could never heal. Bella's discovery of Edward's vampire nature, and by extension the Cullen family's vampire nature, created crisis that Alice had been anticipating through visions, but that still required careful management to prevent Bella from fleeing in terror, or from revealing their secret to authorities, or to her father, who would not believe her claims about vampires. but who might become concerned enough about her mental state or about her involvement with the Cullens to restrict her contact with them in ways that would prevent the relationship development that Alice's visions showed needed to occur before Bella's transformation could happen according to the timelines that Alice had been tracking for decades. Alice positioned herself as Bella's guide and Bella's interpreter during this period when Bella was learning about vampire nature and vampire culture and the specific rules and restrictions that govern the Cullens' existence within human society. Her role as friendly, enthusiastic sister figure, making the terrifying information more palatable, and making Bella's adjustment to the knowledge that monsters were real less traumatic than it might have been if Edward had been her only source of information about what vampires were and what they could do and what dangers they posed to humans who became involved with them romantically or platonically. The baseball game during the thunderstorm represented Alice's attempt to share vampire joy with Bella, to show her the beautiful and exhilarating aspects of immortal existence rather than focusing exclusively on the dangers and the restrictions and the constant struggle against instincts that characterize the vegetarian lifestyle's challenges. Alice wanted Bella to see that vampire existence offered experiences and pleasures that human life could not provide. That transformation would bring losses, but would also bring gains that might make the trade worthwhile for someone like Bella, who seemed more comfortable with vampires than with humans, and who seemed to belong with their family despite her mortality, and despite the constant temptation her blood created for vampires whose control was not absolute even after decades or centuries of practice resisting human prey. But James's arrival during the baseball game transformed Alice's hopeful demonstration into crisis that threatened everything Alice had been working towards since meeting Bella, and everything she had been anticipating since the visions had first shown Bella's face in Asylum Darkness 40 years earlier. The tracker's interest in Bella and his decision to hunt her despite the Cullens' protection created situation where Alice's gift became essential for Bella's survival. Her ability to see James's strategies and his movements through the visions, allowing the family to anticipate his attacks and to position themselves defensively in ways that might prevent him from reaching Bella and completing the hunt that he had committed to pursuing, regardless of the danger the Cullens posed to him, or the likelihood that his hunt would end in his own destruction, rather than in his prey's death. Alice stayed with Bella during the period when they were hiding her from James. The hours spent together in hotels and airports and safe houses, creating opportunities for deeper conversation and deeper bonding than the superficial high school friendship had yet achieved, despite Alice's decades of loving Bella through visions, and despite Alice's desire to accelerate their relationship beyond what Bella's comfort level and Bella's natural wariness about rapid intimacy would normally allow. Alice told Bella about her visions during this time. Her explanation of how she had seen Bella's face for 40 years before meeting her, creating moment of profound connection. When Bella understood that Alice's apparently excessive enthusiasm and apparently presumptuous certainty about their friendship was based not on arrogance or on manipulation, but on decades of one-sided devotion and decades of anticipation that had finally culminated in their actual meeting and their actual relationship that was fulfilling all of Alice's hopes, despite the current danger and despite the fear that James's hunt created for both of them. Bella's response to learning about Alice's decades of waiting and Alice's decades of loving her through visions was exactly what Alice's gift had shown it would be. A combination of wonder and disbelief and profound gratitude that someone had cared about her so completely for so long, without expecting anything in return, and without demanding that Bella reciprocate immediately or completely the depth of feeling that Alice had developed through 40 years of watching Bella's future approach through visions that had sustained Alice through the worst periods of her vampire existence. Bella understood through Alice's explanation that their friendship was not casual acquaintance or convenient alliance, but was bond that had been forming across time since before Bella was born, and since before Alice had known Bella's name or Bella's specific identity beyond the brown-eyed girl whose face had appeared in asylum darkness to guide Alice toward futures that included belonging and family, and the sister that Alice had needed, even when she had not understood what the visions were showing her or why this particular human girl's face would matter so much to Vampire, who had awakened without memories and without maker to explain what the gift meant or how to interpret the images that filled her awareness during those early days of confused newborn existence. James's death in the ballet studio represented both relief and trauma. Alice's visions having shown multiple possible outcomes, including several where Bella died and several where Bella was transformed by James before the family could rescue her from his trap, that had exploited her love for her mother and her willingness to sacrifice herself to protect those she cared about from dangers that she felt responsible for, even when the threats were not her fault, and even when her human fragility made her incapable of actually protecting anyone from supernatural predators whose strength and speed rendered human intervention meaningless, except as distraction or as bait. Alice arrived too late to prevent James from biting Bella, but arrived in time to help Edward extract the venom before transformation could progress beyond the point where reversal was possible. Her participation in Bella's rescue and her presence during Bella's recovery in the hospital creating foundation for the deeper trust and deeper intimacy that their friendship would develop during the months following the crisis, when Bella was healing physically and emotionally from the trauma of nearly dying and nearly becoming vampire before she had made conscious choice about transformation and about whether immortality with the Cullens was truly what she wanted for her future. The aftermath of James's attack intensified Alice's protective devotion to Bella and intensified her certainty that Bella's transformation needed to happen sooner rather than later, because human fragility made Bella vulnerable to dangers that vampire nature would render harmless or at least survivable through the enhanced durability and enhanced healing that immortal existence provided to those who underwent transformation from mortal to supernatural. Alice began advocating within family discussions for Bella's transformation, despite Edward's resistance and despite Carlisle's concerns about transforming someone so young and someone who had not yet had opportunity to experience human adulthood or human experiences that transformation would deny her permanently. Once she became vampire, whose arrested development would freeze her at whatever age the transformation occurred. But Alice's visions showed that delay was dangerous, that Bella's continued mortality created ongoing risks from the Volturi, who would eventually learn about her knowledge of vampire existence and would demand either her transformation or her death according to their laws about protecting vampire secrecy from human awareness that could threaten the species through exposure or through organized resistance that human populations might mount if they understood that immortal predators lived among them. Alice saw the confrontation with the Volturi approaching through timelines. That suggested Bella's transformation was inevitable, and that the only question was whether it would happen voluntarily and safely under Cullen's supervision, or would happen under emergency conditions that might result in Bella's death, or Bella's transformation by someone other than the family members who loved her and who wanted to ensure that her change from human to vampire occurred in best possible circumstances with maximum support and maximum preparation for the difficult adjustment period that characterized newborn vampire existence for all who underwent the transformation, regardless of how carefully the process was managed. Alice's friendship with Bella deepened during the months following the James crisis, as they spent time together shopping and talking and simply existing in each other's presence in ways that Alice had dreamed about during the decades of watching Bella's face appear in visions, but had never quite believed it would feel as satisfying and as complete as the reality proved to be. Once they were actually friends rather than vision friends, separated by time and by Bella's non-existence. During the years when Alice had loved her, without knowing whether the visions were showing genuine future or were showing impossible fantasy that would never manifest into three-dimensional reality. Bella's growing comfort with Alice and Bella's growing trust in Alice's visions created partnership where Bella began asking Alice about futures and began relying on Alice's gift to navigate decisions about her relationship with Edward and her relationship with the family, and her eventual transformation that Alice insisted was coming, regardless of Edward's current resistance or Carlisle's current hesitation about transforming teenager who still had human family and human life. That transformation would require her to abandon permanently. Alice saw their future together, extending across centuries and across continents and across experiences that would make their current friendship seem like simple beginning, rather than like culmination of the relationship that Alice had been anticipating since Asylum Awakening. Her visions showing shopping trips and conversations and crises and joys that would fill their immortal existence together as sisters and friends and companions who would never need to fear separation or abandonment, because transformation would make their bond permanent and would make their time together infinite rather than limited by Bella's mortality that currently created urgency and created fear that accidents or illness or human violence might claim Bella before transformation could occur, and could make her immortal, and could make her safe from all the dangers that flesh was heir to, according to Shakespeare, whose words about mortality seem particularly relevant to Alice's current anxiety about Bella's continued fragility. The vision of their future together as immortal sisters made all of Alice's decades of waiting seem worthwhile, and made all of her struggles and all of her loneliness during the years before meeting the Cullens and before meeting Bella seem like necessary preparation for the belonging and the love that she had finally found through patience and through faith in visions that had promised her that better futures were coming if she could maintain her commitment to becoming the kind of vampire who deserved the family and the friendship that the brown-eyed girl's presence in her visions had represented since that first moment in Asylum Darkness, when Bella's face had appeared to guide Alice through awakening and through transformation, and through all the years that followed leading to this present moment when vision had become reality, and when the girl Alice had loved across time had become the sister Alice would love across eternity. One's transformation made Bella immortal and made their bond permanent in ways that human mortality could never guarantee or could never sustain against the inevitable separation that death would create if Bella remained human, rather than choosing vampire existence with the family who loved her. Alice's certainty about Bella's transformation and about their future together made the waiting more bearable. Even during moments when Edward's resistance or Carlisle's hesitation suggested that Bella might remain human, longer than Alice's visions indicated was safe or wise, given the approaching Volturi attention, and given the ongoing dangers that Bella's knowledge and Bella's involvement with their family created for fragile human, whose mortality made her vulnerable to threats that vampires could survive or could avoid through their supernatural abilities and their supernatural awareness of dangers approaching, through Alice's visions that showed futures and showed possibilities and showed the timelines where Bella lived and where Bella died, and where Bella transformed according to choices that had not yet been made, but that Alice could see approaching through the visions that had guided her since Asylum Awakening, and that would continue guiding her toward futures where she and Bella would be sisters forever in immortality, that would finally make permanent the bond that had been forming across time since before they met and since before Bella existed, and since the moment when her face had first appeared in darkness to promise Alice that belonging was coming, and that the waiting would end in adventure that was only beginning. Now that vision had become reality, and now that the girl from Alice's missing years had finally arrived to make those years meaningful, and to make Alice's patient devotion worthwhile through friendship that transcended time and transcended mortality and transcended every obstacle that separated vision from reality during the decades when Alice had loved Bella before Bella knew Alice existed. Alice's journey from the asylum darkness to Bella's arrival was never about missing years at all, but it was instead about preparation and about learning to become the person who could recognize and could protect and could love the sister whose face had appeared in visions long before their actual meeting, made the relationship real in ways that transcended the one-sided devotion that had characterized Alice's decades of watching Bella's future approach through timelines and through possibilities that gradually solidified into certainties as the moment of their meeting drew closer, and as Alice moved through experiences and through choices that shaped her into the vampire who would be worthy of the friendship that Bella's presence in her visions had promised was coming. If Alice maintained her patience and her faith in futures that her gift showed her with increasing clarity across the years of solitude and searching, the brown-eyed girl who had sustained Alice through newborn confusion and through the difficult years of teaching herself vampire nature without maker or guide had been Bella Swan all along, the human whose transformation Alice could perceive approaching through visions that showed their eternal friendship extending across centuries and across continents and across experiences that would make their current bond seem like beginning rather than like culmination of relationship that had been forming since before Bella was born and since before Alice had understood what the visions meant or why this particular face would matter so profoundly to Vampire Awakening. Without memories in institution designed to contain, rather than to heal those whose gifts or whose differences made them unsuitable for normal society's expectations and normal society's definitions of sanity and acceptable behavior. Vision Bella and real Bella had merged into single complete person, who exceeded every expectation and every hope that Alice had developed through 40 years of loving someone she had never met. The reality of Bella's warmth and Bella's courage and Bella's capacity for accepting the impossible and embracing the supernatural, making Alice grateful for every moment of waiting and every moment of loneliness during the years before their friendship became actual, rather than anticipated through visions that had sustained Alice, but had not prepared her completely for how profound the connection would feel once Bella was physically present, rather than existing only in Alice's gift and in Alice's hopes about futures that might or might not manifest according to choices that others would make and circumstances that Alice could perceive but could not entirely control. Their friendship transcended normal temporal boundaries because Alice had loved Bella before Bella existed in Alice's present, had made choices based on vision, Bella's approval or disapproval during decades when Bella was not yet born, and when the relationship existed only in Alice's awareness of futures approaching through timelines that would eventually align to make vision become reality and make promise become presence. The magic of Alice's gift was not simply seeing futures, but was choosing to love those futures before they arrived, choosing to become the person who would deserve the belonging and the family that the visions showed, waiting in timelines that required patience and required faith, that supernatural sight was showing genuine possibilities rather than showing wishful fantasies that would never materialize into three-dimensional experiences. Bella had been there all along, in every vision and in every choice and in every moment of hope during Alice's missing years that were not missing at all, but were instead filled with preparation and with becoming and with the slow transformation from lost girl without memories to self-determined woman who had chosen her own identity and her own values and her own future based on visions that had guided her toward belonging, that would justify every sacrifice and every difficulty she had endured while learning to exist as vampire without the guidance that makers typically provided to newborns struggling through adjustment periods that could destroy those who lacked sufficient support or sufficient purpose to motivate continued existence when immortality felt like burden rather than like gift. The adventure of Alice's years before meeting Bella had always been adventure with Bella in the sense that mattered most. The vision Bella, who had appeared in asylum darkness and who had remained present through every subsequent moment, providing companionship and providing motivation and providing the promise that loneliness was temporary and that family was approaching through futures that Alice could see even when she could not quite reach them through the decades of waiting that separated vision from reality and separated hope from fulfillment. Alice had never been entirely alone during those years because Bella's face had been her constant companion, her guide through darkness, and her reason for choosing compassion over convenience, and her anchor to futures where belonging would replace isolation and where love would replace the emptiness that characterized existence without connection or without purpose beyond simple survival. And now the future continues unfolding in visions that show Alice and Bella together across centuries and across experiences that will test and will strengthen and will deepen the bond that began forming before they met, and that will continue forming across eternity. That transformation will provide once Bella becomes immortal, and once their sisterhood becomes permanent, rather than threatened by mortality that currently creates urgency and creates the bittersweet awareness that their time together in Bella's human form is limited and precious in ways that immortal existence will eventually make unnecessary. Once transformation removes the threat of separation through death, or through aging, or through any of the dangers that flesh is vulnerable to, despite love and despite protection and despite Alice's visions that can show dangers approaching but cannot always prevent those dangers from manifesting into reality. So rest now, Twilight souls, knowing that some friendships are fated across time and across the boundaries that separate vision from reality, and knowing that love can exist before meeting just as surely as love can exist after meeting, when the connection transcends normal temporal progression and transcends normal relationship development through the magic of gifts that allow seeing futures and choosing to love those futures before they arrive in present moments. Let Alice's patient devotion and Alice's decades of faithful waiting carry you softly into dreams where vision becomes reality, and where the missing years were never missing at all, but were instead filled with purpose and with preparation, and with the constant presence of the friend who would eventually become sister, and who would eventually justify every moment of solitude through the belonging that makes immortality bearable and makes eternity seem like adventure rather than like sentence to endless repetition. Sleep with the certainty that visions come true for those patient enough to wait and faithful enough to believe and devoted enough to become worthy of the futures that gifts show approaching through timelines that require decades or centuries to manifest, but that arrive eventually for those who maintain hope and maintain commitment to becoming the people who deserve the belonging that waits in futures visible only to those whose gifts allow seeing what has not yet occurred, but what will occur if choices align, and if faith sustains, and if love persists across time and across every obstacle that separates present from future and vision from reality. Good night, Twilight souls. May your dreams be filled with visions of adventures that span eternity and friendships that transcend time itself.